So I'll give you an example. Like I was doing some oscillating movements with one of my fighters, and his pad holder, the guy that holds his pads, messaged me and said, "What have you been doing?" Like literally, he's bruised my leg through the pads. His leg kicks are so hard. You know what I mean?
That was Graeme Morris, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Before we get to the show today, I wanted to mention a really cool item that is available now from our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, in their store. That item is Exogen Premium Wearable Resistance. Exogen is a series of tight-fitting sleeves along with uniquely shaped fusiform weights that strap directly onto those sleeves. So what I mean is you can have shin sleeves, arm sleeves, shorts, and a vest, and you can strap these uniquely fusiform shaped weights that they're light in nature, 100, 200 grams, that strap on in a way that allows you not only to resist movement very specifically, but also add fine-tuned elements of rotation to that resistance. So this is the next level of wearable resistance. You may have heard this from the show, Hank Kreinhoff talking about it, to Chris Korfist, sprint coach, talking about it. This is the next level in premium wearable resistance. I've used it myself. I love it. I love not only the way it feels and the way you feel form and technique change. It's like combining technique with power. And so often we just think about weighted vests as just pure force, pure downward gravity loaded resistance. This is the ultimate combination of technique with power. And it shows up in things like Chris Korfist being able to take time off an athlete's 10-meter fly by putting the sleeves just on one side of the body, an ipsilateral resistance. We're using the body's own systems, fine-tuning it. And that's what this does. It allows you as the coach or an athlete to create, explore, and fine-tune the way that the resistance is rotationally impacting the body. This is next level stuff, and I know you'll love it. So you can check that out in the Simply Faster store. Head on over to simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com, and get your Exogen gear today. There is so much to talk about when it comes to strength and conditioning. We have this interdisciplinary field with all sorts of means and methods that we can use to train athletes. And a question I get a lot is how I end up integrating a lot of these, the information from the various guests on the show into a training program. I really like talking with other coaches to see what they do with the information that they've gained from the various experts that are in their network. And at the end of the day, seeing that art of how the information is taken and balanced and practically applied to your population is always fun to chat about. Graeme Morris is our guest today. Graeme is a performance coach that consults for a variety of field and combat-based athletes, including world and Australian champions. He's also the head strength coach for the AFL umpires. He has previously worked in rugby league for 6 seasons. Graeme, as I talked about, the integration of information. Graeme has experience learning from many leading coaches. He has spent lots of time traveling and learning and has a huge library of knowledge from a variety of coaching sources. And on the show today, Graeme is going to take us into his own integration, specifically of 2 of the most common interests of many performance coaches, which is 1, game speed, building specific speed in athletes, and 2, his approach to strength and power development. Within these topics, more specifically, he'll talk on his use of closed versus open agility, lateral speed concepts, linear speed, robust running, and then many methods in the weight room highlighting oscillatory isometrics and how he's taken some of Cal Dietz's methods to get great results in terms of power outputs for his own athletes. Graeme has such a practical as well as balanced style to how he implements training. This was a really fun show. Let's get on to it, episode 262 with Coach Graeme Morris. Graeme, it's awesome to have you on the show. Thanks for being here. Could we just start quickly by you sharing with us a few of your main influences when it comes to how you do sports performance and training your athletes?
Hey, Joel, thanks for having me. Always listen to this podcast. It's one of my favorites. In terms of my influences, I probably would say a major influence would be my good buddy here, Wenham Flat. We always throw back and forth ideas. We have similar philosophies and principles, I guess, towards training. In terms of one of my current bosses at the moment, I got it's called Robert Jackson. I work for him at the AFL. He's really kind of teaching me how to organize, be a bit more diligent, communicate a little bit better on that side of thing. And then in terms of like training and that, I'd probably go through a broad spectrum of different influences. The Soviet stuff like the Verkhoshansky and the Bondarchuk for transfer. Then in terms of the strength stuff, I'd say probably Cal Dietz, I really like. And then I got some, I guess, for the track and field stuff would be Altus, sprinkle of Bosch, we'll go into later. And then I got some close friends who I always get to chat to, like Jeff Moyer, Jake Jensen, chat to Gudango, guys like that, Jay DeMayo. I just got some guys in who I, throw some ideas around. Yeah, so that's probably where it is to start with.
Yeah, so I'm excited to get into all this stuff, the speed and strength and everything that you're doing. So we'll start out with the speed, since that typically comes first in the training session so often. Yeah. And then just to talk on your frame of such a common question, I've had this on the show before, but the idea of closed versus open agility. So doing closed drills versus opening things up, and especially in context of the athlete population you work with. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing there.
Yeah. So when I was working in team sports, the thing is, it's such a long competitive season. You're looking from March to September, and then you probably got a pre-season of 3 months. And so that's a large part. There's not much of an off season. So in this pre-season period, you really only have a small window to stimulate speed, change of direction, agility, and all these things. And essentially, it's just a small dose in each warm-up. You get a small amount of time to warm guys up, and you might only have 10 or 15 minutes to try and fit all this in. And then they're going into their specific drills, their technical, tactical drills, and their small-sided games, etc., whatever they have planned on to start with. So in terms of the change of direction and the open, agility drills, obviously early in a pre-season, in a layout, I might have a max velocity day, I might have a acceleration day, and depending if I have 3 on feet sessions or 4, you might have 1 to 2 with a change of direction influence or an agility influence. So I always like to go from a closed scenario to an open scenario, order to chaos. And initially we're working on these change of direction mechanics, because I know everyone's talking about solving these movement problems and everything like that. But if an athlete doesn't have multiple tools to begin with, it's hard for them to select the right tool in this scenario. So, I've worked with primarily rugby league, and what I found was a lot of guys weren't really efficient in a lot of these different movements. So I look at things like shuffle positions, crossover step, just basic deceleration mechanics, backpedaling. We're starting in a closed scenario, sometimes even resisted to slow it down even more. You're building on this each week. It's becoming a little bit more complex. So you might go from closed, you might start becoming a bit more reactive and building these things together, and then they'll start becoming a bit more open. So to give you an example, let's just say we have basic shuffle position. Early pre-season, we might just do a basic shuffle. Then you might do a double shuffle. Then you might do a double shuffle and return. From there, a few weeks of that, we might put players in like a mirror drill where they're kind of reacting to like a cat and mouse type game. So we're putting layers of complexity on it. And then we might put athletes into these positions where they might do one-on-one, they have to get past the player. Then we can add more complexity, 2 versus 2. We're kind of just bleeding on this. And then then we're trying to put these guys into game-like scenarios where it's going to happen automatically when they kind of have these tools. So try and teach them the tools to begin with, and then, give them the ability to perceive what's happening in front of them so they can kind of solve these different problems that are in front of them. And then hopefully that transfers into a game-like scenario.
Just quickly, just because this is the question I always do ask. I know that Jay DeMaio answered this back when it was him and Jeff and Michael Zweifel, but like the idea of what are you getting or seeking in the closed, especially with the change of direction. I think that it's pretty easy when we talk about acceleration and upright running. There's a lot of markers that a lot of people are looking for with athletes. In terms of change of direction, like you said, shuffling and crossover steps, what are the things that athletes might have a hard time with? Like, what's that thing that you are like, hey, like, let's try to clean this up for when we get into the chaotic?
Yeah, I think for me, that it's not balanced to begin with. So you want, find that athletic position so they have the ability to produce force in and out of these positions and be balanced. So a lot of guys, just don't know where to put their feet to begin with. That's what I found, and keeping their feet underneath them. and then just, I guess, orientating the body and being able to relax at the right time and not being stiff, and just teaching those movements to begin with in a closed setting, I think can really help players understand that.
Gotcha. And so like the shuffles, so you said you're like doing resisted shuffles too? Like...
To begin with, you can just do some band resisted, have a big a player hold a band. I learned that from Kier actually many years ago. Slow it down, and you want the players with the feet underneath the hips, driving the ground away from them, but you don't want to drive too far because you have to be able to come back the other way and things like that. Just so to stay in balance. But yeah, that's just slowing it down. You take away the band, and then all of a sudden you're speeding it up, and then you're adding complexity on top of that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I feel like for me personally, like if I was, and I actually am not in a situation where I'm really training athletes through a whole year where we're having that phase of close. So this is where I like asking questions. But I feel like if I were to do that, I would want to treat it like heavy sleds, like using a stimulus that exists outside of what the players are already used to, and at least forcing the way a heavy sled forces better shin angles, I would imagine. Yeah. And I watch athletes do that as well. I've in the gym that I work at, I see that too. Like when athletes have a resistance, most of them will choose a better shin angle. Some of them still don't. So I just think that's interesting.
I think it's also important that when we see on social media, you always see the best athletes doing these positions. You've got to take into account the lower level athletes that don't have the ability to do this as well. Because you're trying to get the whole team more athletic as well, if that makes sense. Because it's always great to see what people do online, but they're picking their number one talented athlete.
Yeah, yeah.
No one's putting up the least talented ones because they just want themselves to look good.
That should be a rule for a week, because you have to put all the athletes who are at the bottom on all your drills, everything you're doing. You have to pick the ones who are struggling and then show only them. How much I think I think that world would be so much better of sports performance, because you're going to see the people. It really is. I feel like so much in sports performances, it's not about the 10% is actually the least, I feel like, marker of a good coach, because those athletes are going to figure it out themselves anyway. They run on a different level. It's almost more those people who are trying to, they're trying to stay robust. They're trying to not get hurt. They have some movement issues that need to get ironed out, and the way they move could get better. Like those are the ones that take the more expertise.
And I think Gordango actually said it to me once when I visited his facility. I'm actually wearing his shirt right now, Freak Strength. But I think he said to me, like for him, change of direction stuff is just strength work in through frontal plane, for different planes of motion. You got a large eccentric load and you're producing force out of it. So, yes, it definitely can get players more robust, and resilient in these areas that are really important in sport.
Yeah.
In terms of, I guess, the linear speed stuff, early pre-seasons, I'm trying to work towards a biomechanical model where, I'm looking at common denominators, and I kind of stole that word from Dan Paff. And, Jonas Dodo talks about attractors. I kind of like the ones he talks about of switching. I think he says projection and reactivity. So I might have a max velocity day, and initially we might be doing build-ups because we're trying to – sometimes early preseason, the athletes have done nothing. So you've got to be really careful how you expose them to high-intensity sprinting. So you might just do build-ups to begin with. These might I quite like wicket drills, because in a team sport scenario, it's very, very hard to try and coach multiple different athletes at once. So if I can put constraints on these athletes and put them in better positions with that coaching, it's easier for me. And especially when I'm not just a pure track and field coach, I'm more of a generalist. And then, from the build-ups, we might go into fly sprints. Into fly sprints, we might go into floating sprints down the line. And then the same thing on my acceleration day. We might be doing resisted sprints to start with, and then we're going from short to long on that day. And then as we're trying to hit this biomechanical model, whether or not it transfers into game-like scenarios, I'm not sure. And then when players probably reach these where I'm trying to get them to, then I might sprinkle in some of these robust running methods. That's, a bit of a buzzword at the time, but, we can start playing around with like taking away some stability by maybe putting your hands across your shoulders to begin with and layering complexity on it that way, because you probably want your players to be able to run under pressure and the perturbations in the field. But I find a lot of people skip that initial step and just go to that, sometimes a bit early. And it's like, I think it's important that we nail the basics first before we go straight into that. Yeah, I think that's quite important. And then as I progress those type of I think you can get a lot of those movements just in your warm up with your switching drills and everything like that, because people say that like those basic drills don't always transfer, but I think with a lot of team sport athletes that don't understand the movements, if you can slow them down in this initial warm up prep, that it does transfer to a degree. So then you can play around that robust running methods within your warm up. But I think it's really, really important that you don't lose sight that in game-like scenarios, a lot of the time players or even in training, they're not exposed to maximal velocity. So I think that's really, really important that we tick off that attribute, because we know that that's really, really important to try and limit hamstring strains, which is one of the number one injuries that occur in team sports. So I think if we can get a chronic load of high-speed running in throughout a preseason in an intelligent way, that's really, really important. So yeah, I might sprinkle in a few of these methods when I think my athletes are able to do it, but I'm always trying to expose them to speed. And then we're going into our drills, and that's when I think people are talking about game speed at the moment. For me, I think you can get a lot of this game speed in your technical tactical drills. Because, I mean, for me, game speed is the ability to, I guess, be quick in and out of a variety of different positions, which you can kind of plug that in at the end. Once these guys hit all these different elements, you might want to sprinting guys off like different scenarios, you know, out of curves, out of arcs and things like that. And a lot of team sports scenarios, you're going to find that when they're accelerating, it's a little bit different to track and field because they're already in upright posture, because they have to be looking up the ball, gazing and everything like that. I think Hakan Anderson actually said it means it's a lot more hip extensors. It's a lot more influence. The hip extensors doing a lot more work in that scenario when you have to accelerate from the upright position. So you can play around that type of stuff. But in terms of the game speed stuff, and which is another thing that everyone's talking about right now, for me, it kind of comes back to, this is a thing I stole from Fergus Connolly, but like, not only do you want your players to be quick, you want them to be quick above the shoulders. And in a team sport scenario, there's only four real things that are occurring in a game. There's attack, there's defense, there's transition to attack, and there's transition to defense. And in defense, we're trying to take away space from the opposition. And then in attack, we're trying to create space. And, you know, when you create space, that gives your athletes the ability to actually be quick. They can actually use that speed now. But to create that space, you need to have intelligent players. And this is where they need to understand the game plan, which is really, really important. That's more of a head coaching type role, that all the players understand the game plan. They understand what they should be executing, where they should be on the field, where the ball should be circulating, where they should be circulating, what's the correct sequencing to create this space. And then when they have that space, they now have the ability to hopefully use that speed. Because you probably know, Joel, like you see these guys and you know they're not quick, but they always seem to have time on the field. And for me, a lot of that's kind of game speed. It's like making the right decisions at the right times, being in the correct position. And then if we can kind of get these two things together, I think that's where the magic happens.
Yeah. So I'll take that back a little bit to, so you're talking first about just the regular linear speed, and then we'll get into some of the game speed stuff. And I really like the idea of the space and how that almost facilitates you to express your speed. Because if you never have space, how are you ever going to express the speed that you built? But I just like how what you're saying, it just resonates with what a lot of other coaches have said in team sport physical prep, is you have to get some sort of max velocity exposure. Yes. And so along with like the wickets, and I like the one thing that stands out to me too with team sport is the ability to do switching. Like for track athletes, that's pretty standard, but I think in team sport, it's so less common that they can do, or Darren Barr calls it remove, replace, like to remove the foot that's on the ground before the leg that's in there starts coming down. So many people just bring the leg down kind of passively. And I think that that core ability is not there so oftentimes in team sport athletes.
It can be a train wreck at the start, honestly. Like you show some players have never been exposed to any of this type of stuff. And they find it really, really difficult. And I think a lot of the boom exercises from Chris Corfest. I kind of layer it on that, your single booms, your triple booms, your boom booms. I know you got some boom videos you used to do back in the day on YouTube. I stole a few of those as well. And I think that switching ability is really, really important. I like the primetime drills. I think they're great as well. Yeah. And just putting these into your warm-ups, every single session. And, players will pick up this, and I think that can transfer over onto the field.
Yeah, I almost look at those two drills. I mean, like the running drills, and I like the wickets too. And I almost feel like there's got to be some similarities. I would use a lot of wickets when I would work with club track ages, basically looking at ages like 9 to 12 or 9 to 14. Now you got a mess of kids, and it's like half of them aren't paying attention. And in some ways, maybe that is sometimes some teams on the higher level, but you have to find a way to let them go through without. I mean, you can't coach everyone, and sometimes I think it's not good to coach everyone. And so I was getting to the point where I would have them be running through and I know Tony Haller's got a million like rhythm drills that are really cool. And one of the favorite ones I had was just run through with one arm for those kids, like just run through with one arm, or just simple stuff like that. And then run off it, bring in both and run off of it and stuff like that. And it made it a lot easier for those groups. Yeah.
I mean, some athletes really, really struggle at the start they start bounding from. So I even made it simpler and just did cones to start with. Like week 1, just do cones so guys feel comfortable running over it. And then I might put a couple of mini hurdles at the end. And then each week I add a couple more mini hurdles. And when they become efficient at that, okay, guys, now you're running through with your hands across your shoulders. Okay, now we're going to run through with your football on one side, and you're going through one side on this through half of it this way, and then we're switching across. Then we might switch across side to side and make it more complex as we go through. That can be quite powerful, I think.
Yeah, to me, as you said, the theme of those to me is connectivity. And I think what I was getting with the arms, like the one arm, especially for those younger athletes, is with younger athletes, usually the thing that they haven't developed yet, that they are in process, is really connecting the arms to the legs in like arm straightening as it comes down towards the bottom type manner. A lot of them are more rotational, and they just haven't. I don't call it core strength. Because I've given people like David Weck's pulsars before, and instantly they get connected. Like it's like this little shaker in them helps them to connect their arms to their legs better. So clearly they had the core strength. So, but I think even with like not having your arms, you have a greater awareness of what your spine and all those little spinal muscles that connect are doing. Having a ball and rotating, you have to have an awareness of how that's connecting down into the bottom. And I think I just like with the wickets, I think that, like you said, people bounding over, or it just becomes about air time. Well, it's like when you're a team sport, like you're on the ground, like it probably is not advantageous to be like flying and bounding over these things. And I do think about how Joel Reinhardt talked about like good soccer players do have the ability to get out of just pure low heel recovery mode and get up into a more track-esque and then go back down into the like an elite player he referenced. So I think that would be the dream, to have different strategies of running,
Yeah, and I think, they're getting so much of that type of stuff, like specific game-like stuff in their training anyway. Exposing them to these upper types of drills is, if anything, can build some coordination and just teach guys awareness of their body, some relaxation, a bit of coordination, and reduce a bit of stiffness, a bit of fluidity, things like this, which typically in like, probably 5-10 years ago, we weren't really talking about this term so much. And I think they're starting to become a little bit more important these days. Yeah. People are starting to understand, hey, we need to have good, efficient movements on the field. Not only do you want them to be able to move well and fast in a variety of directions, if they can do that, they're probably less likely to be injured.
I wanted to take a break from the show and briefly share with you the difference that performance herbalism can make for you. Several years ago, I had Logan Christopher, CEO of Lost Empire Herbs, on the show to talk about hypnosis and mental training for athletes. While talking to him, I realized he also had an herbalism company. So shortly thereafter, I used the Phoenix formula, which was my first product I bought from them. I had great results with it, not only increasing my energy and decreasing my need for coffee and caffeine, but I also noticed that it was making an impact on my lifts and my weight room numbers. I was having a great training experience. Shortly thereafter, I also got into the Shilajit resin as well as other herbs. And I don't look at supplementation the same way. I'm a strong believer in what Logan and his company are doing in looking for a natural resource to boost human performance. If you want to check out the herbs that I use personally from Lost Empire Herbs, you can head to www.lostempireherbs.com/justfly. There you can get 15% off your order, and they offer a 365-day money-back guarantee. Definitely check them out. Let's get on back to the show.
Yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, I saw. I remember about 3 years ago. It's like a global hamstring seminar. This was in California, that hosted by Paul Cater, who's been on the show. And there was a coach from Spain who I don't think he has like a social media. It's just like he's just an in the trenches coach working with soccer players in Spain in the big clubs there. And it was a thing where like they would do drills on one side of the field and then kind of get tired. And then they would run across the field over like little low wickets, like just to experience being tired and doing a more of soccer-esque, low heel recovery type movements, and then experience as you're under fatigue. Now you have to run across the field with a little bit more lift to your strategy and change strategies. And I was like, oh, that's genius. That's so awesome. So cool. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. All right. So I want to get to just a couple other things. One is, and you mentioned with the space, I've never thought about it that way until you just said it there. But the idea that you have to create space basically to use your speed, and it's like, it's almost like the game speed or what you said between the ears and your physical abilities kind of have to rise in tandem, I think, for you to really be effective. Because if your physical speed and gifts is rising, but you don't know how to manage space, like how are you ever going to use it except for that one freak breakaway play? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, you see it all the time. You see when an athlete gets transferred to a better team, and all of a sudden they, like in rugby kind of thing, they might have had 5 tries one season, and the following season they had 15 tries. It's like, well, it's because they've got space now. You know what I mean? They had the ability to express their speed and be out in the open. And I mean, a lot of that is tied down to, I haven't put a lot of this into place, but a lot of this is down to this tactical periodization type scheme that everyone's starting to throw around now. But I think Fergus Connolly's works really, really good like that. And if you can start bucketing your exercises, the drills, it's kind of, you need a holistic approach with your head coach, and you start bucketing drills. Hey, today we're going to be working on maybe capacity. So we're going to have these drills that are going to be a bit more open. This other day we're going to have drills that are going to be, we're going to be working more speed. And it's important when we talk about, I think what happens in a lot of team training is that people just build more and more, but rather than that, all we're getting is a watered down effect. So we need to have these drills and they be executed at game speeds or above, rather than just slowing everything down. If that's the way to train, it's probably how you're going to play. So we need to have these drills that are really quick. Everyone's on the same page. They understand the game plan. They understand where they need to be. When they have this ability to do this, they're going to be able to express speed on the field. But yeah, you can change drills, and there's no real set rule, I don't think. I think it's just like sitting down and working out, hey, these drills fit into this scenario, these drills fit into this scenario. And that's probably a good for an injury prevention method anyway, because, one day we might be working in more of a short type space. That's going to put a lot more stress on the groin area, your glute area, your calf area, because you're changing directions quite a bit. It's going to be potentially more anaerobic because a lot of change of directions. Whereas the other day it's going to be more open. You're probably going to hit some higher speeds. It's probably going to be a little more stressful on the hamstrings. It might even be more aerobic because there's going to be a lot more space. And then you can kind of layer that so that when one muscle group's, recovering the other day, you know what I mean? So you can have this higher low type thing like that and playing around with that. Yeah. That gets quite complex going into this.
Yeah. Well, I like, actually, I was just taking away or just thinking of it in the sense of like muscle groups, like shorter space works the calves and feet more. And it's funny because it makes a lot of sense. And I like the idea too of, and I'm just thinking it for just a general perspective. Like I take that to my own experience as a track and field high jumper. And I felt like when I stopped playing team sports, and this isn't just me, this is a lot of track athletes, like jump athletes, especially when they stop playing like basketball or something, they they only do track. They oftentimes lose something. And I'm always thinking of what they're losing. And I do think so much of that is they lose. Josh Waitzkin, I'm reading his book, The Art of Learning, and he calls it drawing smaller circles. Like basically you're getting tighter and faster, tighter and faster, tighter and faster as you go through the process. But I just think in those little sports, there's so many little quick jabs and cuts and movements that, like heel tapping, even just the heels just kind of going, and those little quick movements.
Yeah, I saw you playing around with that the other day.
Yeah, exactly. And it's amazing too. And you get that rhythm, right? That's that rhythm of those heel taps and how that leads into a jump. It's more than what we think about. That's why I think when we play basketball or pick up basketball, even I've played racquetball and I set my all-time vertical jump record standing after a couple of games of racquetball, just because it's just so short and it tunes up. But I hadn't heard how you said, okay, we're going to work short. This should stress this muscle group more. And that'd be interesting too, to think, well, let's fill the bucket you didn't get in the weight room later. Like if you just were doing all the short space stuff, maybe your quads and your groin and glutes are kind of cashed out. So why are we going to go, let's maybe train a little more hamstrings in the weight. I don't know, like something like that could be mindful to also know where an athlete's stress was. Yeah.
Or you might say, hey, we're just going to add even more onto that, but then let them recover over the next couple of days.
Yeah.
Well. Does it make sense? You know what I mean? So you might have a short high speed day type thing. And then the following day, you might have more of an open area type thing, but we're going to slow it down a little bit more because then we're going to get a little bit more aerobic and you have a day off and then we can repeat this again. So we're having this undulating of speed and stress throughout the week. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. With the game speed stuff, so the stuff between the ears though, and then just like to draw some context or just like how this fits with where the athletes you work with, like higher level, pro, semi-pro, like athletes who are at a high level. For game speed, I mean, that's just mostly the coaches. Like that's. I mean, where do you fit into all that, and how do you see, like maybe working with lower level players or school age players? How do you see that fitting in?
In terms of the higher level, I think that's where you have to have a good relationship with the coach, because you can start talking about, hey, these drills are only being performed at this type of speed. We need to up the speed of this. So you can have those conversations and things like that. In regards to like the younger players and things like that, well, I really think that we need to expose these athletes at younger ages to more speed stuff, related stuff. I mean, in Australia anyway, there's not really a massive culture of track and field. Everyone's playing a lot of Australian rules football, maybe soccer, rugby union, rugby league. So, I think if we can expose these athletes to some sprinting a bit earlier, it'd be a big benefit for a lot of them, especially at a younger age. I think Stefan Jones always talks about how the ages you got to, I'm not sure what it was, but, you want to expose these athletes at a young age to all these type of things, especially when they're a bit more plastic. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the dream, isn't it? Get these kids through. So someone was telling me once, like, all the best coaches are at the elite, and you have a lot of up-and-coming strength coaches or strength and conditioning coaches at the bottom. But in some aspect, we should probably flip it. have all the high-level coaches with the younger kids and the opposite way around, because they need the more work done at the start, and you're going to have these super athletes at the end.
Yeah, that's completely true. I mean, I know here in the United States, there is an immense need for good coaches with young athletes, because there's so much just like things that young athletes are doing that they shouldn't be. And there's not enough quality speed. I mean, honestly, if it comes, like you said, if it comes down to like a young athlete doing track season or lifting weights, do track season. Why would like that? If people just saw that at the higher levels, it's not the grinding lifting that's going to make the difference, it's speed. I think that they would understand that earlier on, and athletes enjoy that more. I think, well, not all. I think a lot of athletes enjoy lifting, but
And it doesn't take that long to develop the strength that you're after.
Yeah,
really. But developing speed at a young age, I think, is going to have some greater benefits on your athletic performance down the line. Not only that, just being the ability to move or in all these multi directions is really important. And it's funny you say that, Joel. So I reckon working with younger athletes is a big business opportunity for a lot of coaches, because parents want to see their kids be gun athletes. Yeah. Because a lot of parents live through their kids and are like, oh, that's my kid. Look how good he is. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of parents out there probably willing to pay a lot of money towards their kids and try and to develop them at these younger ages. So hopefully, down the line, we're going to see a lot. I think we're starting to see it now, to be honest. It's starting to pick up. You're starting to see a lot more of these private facilities pop up now. I know that's happening in Australia anyway. We've got some good private facilities starting to pop up and starting to introduce a lot of these concepts to younger athletes now. And I think that's quite exciting.
Yeah, it is good. It also is a double-edged sword in the sense of, there's also the overserved athlete too. I mean, that's a whole different discussion, but the athlete who has every coach for everything. And, like Stefan talks a lot about too, like the natural athlete, like if we all just played in this, played in the street or like just did different sports and just kind of like did all these things and did, track or gymnastics and swimming, we wouldn't need these facilities to a large extent.
And I think that's, we don't want to create robots. You got to let them play. And a lot of the time that just put them in these positions, like playing games, and they'll probably find these positions anyway. But it's a lot different now to when we were kids. I I grew up on a farm and I was shooting hoops before school. I was doing all sorts. Every day I was either working on a farm or I was playing sport, and that's what we did.
Yeah.
But now kids don't do that, mate.
That's the original training right there, what you did. Farm and sports.
Yeah, farm and sports. That was my life, mate, when I was a kid. And kids aren't doing that now, mate. So I guess a lot of parents just don't want their kids to go outside and do all these things. So, maybe we have to bridge that gap somewhere.
Yeah. Okay, so quickly, before we transition more to the weightlifting type stuff, and maybe this is a good bridge, first, I know there was an anecdote of where, the Cure when flat talks about not going full Bosch. Apparently that came from you. I actually am curious to how that came about. And then just talk about how do you approach some of that? Like just trying to get more coordinative in the weight room, like coordination versus general and some of those exercises. So tell me the story first, and then we can get into that.
Yeah, well, it was back in the CVAS about 3-4 years ago, and Jay DeMayo's seminar, and he always at the end of the talks, he always has all his kegs of great beer and stuff like that, and it's always this stronger IPA stuff, and I probably had a few in me, to be honest. and I was talking. I always looked up to Chris Corfus, I always loved reading his drills. I remember I used to pester him all the time, and he used to talk back to me. So when I got to meet him after we had this conversation, I did his lecture. I really enjoyed it, but I actually said to him, never go full Bosch. And then obviously Jeff Moyer was there and Kia was there, and they found it hysterical. And the only reason I said that is because I actually like some of Fran's concepts and that. But for me, when I was working in a lot of rugby league space, and what I was seeing in a lot of these contact type sports, all of a sudden I was seeing all over social media everyone playing around with these coordination exercises within the gym. And for me, in a sport, don't get me wrong, I know my athletes need to be coordinated and they need to move, but they have to run through brick walls. They need to be robust. There's a lot of contact. It's just, if you watch the sport, it's just a huge amount of collisions. And I said it tongue in cheek because the thing this is probably my take. The thing is, in the weight room, on the field, you got so much specificity. And then in the weight room, it's a time for the athletes to get some general strength. And you have all these tried and tested methods that we know that are out there, just basic strength training, okay? You got plyometrics, you got medicine ball training, you got ballistics, we've got jumps, the load lifting derivatives. And we know that, in certain doses now, these things do transfer to athletic performance. We know that. There's research out there that shows that. And if you go full Bosch, if you do that, and I think this is not just Fran's Bosch in particular, it's any system out there. If you get caught too far on one side of the system, I think you're missing out on a lot of other important attributes that are out there. I think it's good to be balanced in your principles and your methodology and things that you're doing. And I think you can sprinkle in some of these exercises here and there, but you just got to be careful, because if you're putting a lot of these things into your gym room activities, you have to remove something else out. And you're removing things out. And with the Bosch stuff inside the gym, for me, it's like, how do you know that it transfers 100%? How do you know? It's very hard to say, yes, this transferred to the field, because it's really hard to measure transfer on the field. Whereas just basic things in the weight room, we can just measure. We know that if we improve RSI, we're going to have a little bit more stiffness on the field. If we improve rate of force development, hopefully that's going to transfer in the field. You can measure these things and you can try and hopefully we're getting this transfer, whereas the other way around, I'm not sure, it's hard to measure. And I think having general strength is still really, really important. I still think, athletes need to have good tissue quality, which you can build in the weight room. I think athletes need to be strong. They need to be able to run through. This is in my context of like rugby and rugby league and things like that. They need to be able to be strong. And then we can use those field activities before what I talked about to tie in a lot of those coordinated factors. And then you can still work on some coordination and stuff in the weight room anyway, because you have all these other different methods you can play around with.
Yeah, it makes me think about, I just had Kieran Nick DeMarco on talking about the different, the need-based buckets, and what does an athlete really need? Do they need mass? Do they need body composition? Do they need speed? Do they need strength? And then I think about like the Bondarchuk pyramid, and you have the competitive exercise, the SD, the SPE, and the general. And it's almost like am I going to take, if an athlete needs those, that, like you said, you're going to take, if you're going to put in some really like something that's really coordinative and trying to be specific in the weight room, you're going to take away from probably like the general exercise bucket. But what if an athlete needs more general exercises? And so you just have to be really particular about why and what you're giving up. Like you said, what are you not doing now?
Exactly right. And just because it's general doesn't mean it doesn't transfer.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Especially with, it definitely transfers. And then it also just breaks up the monotony of just specific training, which is really, really important as well. But yeah, I think it's important to be balanced in everything.
I'd like to get to transition a little bit. We're talking about some of the more unique elements of things in the weight room from time to time, or things that people might follow. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, based off of a lot of people you've learned under, is where do you stand on the 1x20 lifting spectrum? I know you utilize other methods, but where's your balance point in that system of weightlifting and training?
I've only used it sparingly with some younger athletes, and it definitely worked. But obviously, my buddy Jeff and Jay both always talk about it. I know they're influenced by Dr. Yesus, and they reckon. I know they had some really, really good results with it. My friend Jake Jensen as well, he's talked about using it. So I'm sure it works because a lot of coaches that I highly respect use it. But to me, I've never really specifically used it. You could probably put it early on in a preseason period, but for me, it's just whether or not my athletes would buy into it at the appropriate time. And so when I was working in rugby league, I'm not sure if my athletes would have bought into a 1x20 method at the start. So, for me, a big part of it is also, is it the perfect program, am I going to get buy-in into the program? So I think with the appropriate athlete and the appropriate time, it'd probably be really beneficial. But I don't have a huge amount of experience with it, to be honest. But my GPE phase is probably trying to tick off those same qualities that what they talk about in the 1x20 method, if you know what I mean. I'm looking to do enhanced tissue quality, target different ranges of motion, different joint positions in a more of a low stimulus fashion, trying to get a good foundation of strength without burning the athletes out early pre-season. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I was just curious because I guess maybe by association, I figured that was something that you utilized quite a bit. Based off of being close to those people.
I haven't had a great amount of experience in it, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, as I said, those guys are gun coaches and they like it. So I'm sure it works really well.
Got it. So in terms of just strength, though, in general, kind of looking at that train of things, I know you've posted some elements that I guess we could call alternative strength methods, but I'm interested in chatting about them. And that I know you sent me this video, I think on social media, but it was like doing a oscillatory hop up and down off of a plate in a lunge position with the front foot.
Yeah.
And so tell me about oscillatory work. Has been really, it's been fascinating to me for a long time, but I always enjoy hearing how people utilize it and implement it in their training. So tell me a little bit about your experience with oscillating work.
Start off with like 85-90% of my training is proven and I guess methods that I know that are big rocks, but I always like to experiment with that final 10%. And I've been playing around with some of these movements after watching Cal Dietz stuff. And that one there is just something that I come up with. And I really I played around with it, and then I started programming it for my online clients, and the feedback was really, really good. We did it at the start of a session, and they said they felt their nervous system felt much more, lit up. They were ready to go, and they felt that their training after that, doing those movements, really, really improved. In regards to the oscillating movements, I like to use them during the peaking phase because they're kind of, during those peaking phases, I want to reduce the amount of heavy loads that we're kind of working with anyway. And I'm working on more, I guess, qualities such as speed, relaxation, rate of force development. And you want to give them, as you're leading up to the competition period, you want to kind of decrease stress a little bit in the amount of eccentric stress that you're doing. So I always find that guys rebound in strength really, really highly there. I'm not sure if it's because it's a deload in the max strength that you've given them, or it's because that could be a major part of it, to be honest. But, I think this relaxation, the ability to contract and relax is a really important thing that athletes can take away. So, yeah, that one I sent through to you, I do that. I also like it because it allows you to focus on smaller ranges of motion. So if you're doing that with, like, say, even with your upper body, you can focus on like just the oscillating 2 to 3 inches at the bottom of a fly movement or like a dumbbell press, and you kind of strengthen those areas around the shoulder. And I can do that, say, with like a chest supported row, just the final moments. That can carry over to a grapple or a clinch position. I can do it in a mid squat position or a mid split squat position. And that's kind of where the region of force productions occurs in a lot of sports. It's like kind of like your power position. So yeah, I quite like it. I might only use it for 3 weeks of the phase, but it's just a small part of my whole probably holistic approach to training. But to be honest with you, Joe, I'll probably use them more with my fighters at the moment, because those speeds and contractions are more specific to what occurring in a sport. And with fighters, because I'm working with a lot of combat athletes at the moment, a lot of Muay Thai and kickboxers, Muay Thai athletes and kickboxing athletes. When they're going into training camp, the training load's so high that I want to decrease that eccentric stress and those heavy loads. So I started using these oscillating movements a little bit more, and it kind of freshens them up, and I'm still maintaining some strength, and I really like it, to be honest. Yeah, and all the guys that have used it really, really like it as well. And I've been utilizing those reflexive trimetrics a lot more as well with my fighters. I don't know if you've seen those ones.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that. Before I do, actually, I have a couple of questions on the oscillatory work, and I'll save the trimetrics, because that's something I've seen and I haven't used that at all. So I'm curious to ask you your experience with that. But so the oscillatory, so you're saying that you like it for either the warm up or you'll use it in peaking. Okay. So the warm up stuff, that drill that I sent you, I just used it in the warm up. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. That one I sent you when you're hopping on and off, and that was more of I did that in the warm up. But I've used the from Cal's stuff, I've used the oscillating movements and the time sets, because when you have a lack of resources with athletes, like those time sets work really, really well. But I use them more for accessory movements, to be honest, Joel. Yeah. Oh, interesting.
For the accessories at the end. Hey?
Interesting. So like a time set, like a timed so you have 10 seconds to do oscillatory bench press or something like that, instead of, I mean, it's hard to do reps on that, to say you do 10 reps of oscillating, because to count and go as fast as you can is not an easy thing. No. For the time sets, I'd probably do full range of motion. Oh, really? That's a different movement. So if you're a coach and you have lack of resources and you have no velocity based, you don't have a gym wear, you don't have a push band or something like that, you can say to an athlete, hey, we're going to work this split squat as many reps as possible in 7 seconds, roughly where your creatine ATP system is dominant, and you can go up and down as fast as possible in that 7 seconds. And then you count as many reps as you can do with that weight, and that's your progression. So I've used that in team sport scenarios where you've got time sets one day, you might have oscillating movements on another day, and then that's as my accessory movements. But then my strength movement will be more of probably like a banded movement. So like, or for my main exercises, just say if I was using the trap bar, for example, I might use a low handle trap bar GPP phase. Then as we go into more of a strength phase, I'd do a high handle trap bar. And then when we're going into, say, the peaking phase, I'll do a trap bar, banded trap bar, or I might do a banded squat. And then I'll do my oscillating movements and my time sets as my accessories around that, while still keeping some big rocks in my program so that I don't lose any of the strength that we've kind of gained throughout the period. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when you say accessories, does that mean it's accessory lifts, like instead of barbell, bench, dumbbell? I mean, it's a really simple rudimentary example. But sorry. I get you. When I say accessories, I mean, I guess more of the assistant exercises, if you call them assistant. Sure. Yeah. So you go like heavy hex bar deadlift with band, or moderate with band, so it's speed wise. That'd be like a normal lifting, but you're still trying to go for speed, but I'm still keeping that strength there. And then for my assistant exercises, perhaps I'm doing split squats, oscillating, perhaps I'm doing split squats, time sets. Got it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. So I'm kind of like, I'm still keeping, because I like more a vertical integration type method with my athletes rather than a block method. So I like to focus on a couple of qualities while still keeping a thread on all different qualities, because for me, that's a more robust method than doing a block method. Because if an athlete gets hurt or something in sport, you've been doing a block type method,
you can lose a lot of your qualities really quickly. Whereas if you look at the more of the agile periodization type thing that Mladen Jovanovic talks about, if an athlete gets injured, you're not going to lose as many qualities because you still tick them off along the way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You're looking more at worst case scenarios. It's more agile.
I like that. I like, actually, I haven't heard anyone mention that in a while, but the idea of starting with a bigger lift that is probably a little slower, relatively speaking, and then dropping down into the oscillatories. I've always found that to be tremendously effective. I've even used it in probably, I guess you could call it earlier training phases where there's a heavier squat or something, and then you're still kind of, you're almost like not erasing, but you're almost writing over the neural pattern of that slow squat with a contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax, and always putting that as a priority.
And it's important to just point out as well, Joel, it depends on the type of athlete you're working with. Because if you're working with a rugby athlete, you're going to have to keep a lot of those strength things in there, okay? But if you're working with, say, what's another type of athlete? A hockey player or something where you don't have to run into brick walls, and you might be able to play around more of these oscillating type movements because max strength is not quite as important. So it probably depends on the sport. So what I was talking about before was probably more to do with the population that I've worked with in regards to how I explained to the fighters and the rugby players in the past.
You're talking field hockey there, right? Not ice hockey.
Yeah. Sorry, field hockey.
Yeah, because people listening in the United States will say, "What is this guy talking about?" Because I made that mistake.
No.
Yeah, Nikolai Morris from New Zealand corrected me on that too. I thought she worked with like female ice hockey players. What's going on here?
Hey, Joel, I didn't see snow till I was 21 years old, mate. So our winter, it's 10 degrees. At 10 degrees Celsius at the lowest, you know what I mean? So, yeah, no ice sports over here, mate.
Yeah. I've grown to learn that is the case. So, I like that. I was going to ask you, or say just to comment too. I like the idea of one day being a full range like time sets. And actually, I'll say this too, as I think that velocity based training is great, but I think it's almost like sometimes when we have so much nice things, we almost forget about the thing that honestly I think is either the same or nicer, which I would prefer. If I had to pick one or the other, I actually would take a time set, because I like that there's rhythm and there's contraction and relaxation. And I mean, again, I like tendos. I like that stuff. I think I've used them in my own athletic performance training and the athletes I've worked with quite a bit. And I think it's really helpful, but I also just really think time sets are great. And I haven't heard anyone talk about them in a while. And it was the great Tadeusz Starzyński, the Polish jumps coach, with the time squat sets in the 80s. That was originally what got me onto it. Yeah. So it's good to hear it.
Well, that's because everyone's always trying to chase numbers, and they see this power production, the power output on a gym aware, and they get excited by it. And then people always if you can measure it, it means that, look, I've improved this. Relaxation, coordination, and these things that we're talking about, they're very, very hard to measure. But I've experimented with them. My athletes like them. When you do them, you actually feel really, really good. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the issue. When people get worried when they can't actually measure something all the time, and then they worry about whether or not it transfers. But that's the problem with these things. It's really, really hard to assess transfer, Joel, because with so many moving parts that all you're trying to do is just get these little adaptations everywhere, and you're hoping that they come together and create a bigger adaptation that's going to improve performance. So a lot of the time people will say, show me the evidence of this and that. Well, you can't always show evidence, because for a start, a lot of the studies that are being taken place is just university students anyway. Mm-hmm. So of course they're going to get better at doing that. But a lot of the times the population that you work with, there is no research on them doing the specific training methods that you do. So quite often you just got to talk to other coaches and see what's worked with them, trial and error with your own things. Speak to your athletes. How does it feel? Well, I'll give you an example. Like, I was doing some oscillating movements with one of my fighters, and his pad holder, the guy that holds his pads, messaged me and said, "What have you been doing?" Like, literally, he's bruised my leg through the pads. His leg kicks are so hard. You know what I mean? So that's good feedback for me. It might not be evidence-based, but I'll take it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, those are the things that you work with though. Like those, and I find that I have to do that sometimes. I have like an Evernote file, like of those types of situations. That's like, okay, here's what I was doing. And it's a complex situation. You kind of try to put together that thing that you feel like really worked effectively there.
And I think most of us have these big rocks in training. We all do similar things. But, I like to play around with that extra 10%.
Yeah.
Because it makes training more fun as well. And the other thing is just with big heavy lifting in general. I only lift 2 days a week now, Joel, because I'm 38 as well with my own training. And you know what's really surprised me? I only lift 2 days a week, probably 40 minutes. What surprised me is that my strength hasn't really gone down. And I've been doing that for 5-6 years. It hasn't gone up, mind you, but the strength in the weight room hasn't gone down. And I think people don't realize that you can maintain this strength relatively easy just by doing other things as well. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, for me particularly, I mean, I'm the prototypical like elastic athlete that I need. If I don't get maximal contractions from sprinting or jumping or some sort of plyometric exercise, and usually in the emotional state too, where I'm racing somebody or competing in some way, shape, or form, my lifts will not be the best they can be. And I have to have that. And all my best strength to body weights that I've had have actually been when I was doing more like team sport or plyos or track competitions. And then when I actually trained explicitly for powerlifting using powerlifting programs, I did set lift PRs, but I also gained like 15 pounds to do it. and it just wasn't my jam.
Yeah. And look, I think plyometrics are so undervalued, and not even from a power production point of view, just for making that from the knee down, really from the knee down, knee ankle complex down, really resilient and robust. And, I think Hank Krahenhoff always says, was it jumping's for cats, not for cows, but I always have a good theme of a lot of extensive jumps and extensive plyos in my program in that initial phase. I think it's so beneficial just to get that resilience or robustness around those areas, and then try and layer a little bit more intensity on those plyometrics as you go through, unless you've got a really, really, really heavy athlete. Yeah. Sometimes you've got to be careful.
I was having that exact conversation with a coach just yesterday. No. I was watching football linemen do like a single leg hopping bounding drill. And I've been thinking about this before, but I was talking to the coach about the idea of like, everyone can use the basics, like the rudimentary, low extensive plyos, low amplitude. You're not going very far because all those operate on the principle of general energy return. And once you get an athlete who's too big or heavy or not suited for plyos, they're making that bound bigger is not going to work in the same mechanisms as an elastic athlete. They're going to push too much. They're going to use it's going to be all external rotation and calf and not like the foot coming up. And so the thought of mine is like, everyone should do basic, extensive, or rudiment-based stuff, but based off of your elastic ability determines how far you should take all that stuff.
Exactly right. Yeah. Because you can break some athletes doing that stuff if you go too intense, for sure. But as we were talking about before, you were talking about the reflexive trimetrics, and I've been playing around with these probably for the last 4 or 5 months. Yeah.
Can you explain what they are too real quick as well, just before you get too far into it? Because I'd like to hear as well, again, what that is.
It's a method I see from Cal Dietz uses, and basically you hook up like a belt around your waist, and you have a bunch of bands that are pulling you down into the ground. So it's easy just to set up in pegs at the bottom. And these bands are trying to pull you into the floor. And then you can have like a bar in front of you that you're holding, and you're kind of doing these movements up and down as fast as possible. I use split squat, and I use that 7 to 10 seconds duration, and they're going up and down as quickly as possible. And the bands are so heavy up that you're probably not getting right at the top. But for me, that's kind of like plyometrics for your hips, because in most plyometric jumps, you're mainly targeting your knee and your ankle complex probably more, whereas your hips aren't getting as much work. And then by doing these reflexive trimetrics, you're keeping your foot flat on the ground and you're coming up and down, and you're really, really hitting that hip region. And for me, I was like, for my combat athletes who are, they're trying to produce power in the kicking and the punching, a lot of it stems from the ground up, but also from your hips. And I was like, well, if they're always just doing plyometrics, they're just targeting more that lower limb area, whereas now I can target that hip region a bit more. And I think that's helped for their power production and their striking ability. So that's why I've been utilising them and playing around with them lately and doing them sometimes early in the training. Or sorry, I do them before I do my heavy lifts. And the feedback from them has been really, really good. And it's actually really tough. Like, you should give it a crack one day and try it out. It's crazy the burn you get doing it. And you feel pretty cool afterwards.
And that's part of the oscillatory work that you mentioned, the mat holder was saying.
Yeah, maybe I changed a little bit, but like I probably go more than 2 to 3 inches, 4 inches. I'm working in that region with my fighters, kind of where the force production is in that stance that they're punching from and kicking from. So that's the more of the region I'm working, because it's a bit more specific. But I'm sure you can go for a greater range of motion doing that as well. But you have to play around with it. But yeah. I like it. I like the concept because you get a high amount of density within the set as well. Like the amount of density that you're getting, the band's pulling you down, you're coming up as fast as possible. You might get 20-something reps in 7 seconds, you know?
I think that's the one thing too. And I'll put that in the show notes for everyone listening. Head to justlifesports.com and check the show notes so that you can actually see these movements being done. But one of the things...
Cal's got a big series on YouTube.
Okay. Yeah, right on. I'll try to make sure I get that in there. But the thing I like about the oscillatories, and I mean, I've had Sheldon Dunlap came on and talked about how effective the oscillatory was, putting in that middle phase in the triphasic too. And the thing I think about is like, yes, I mean, we talk about max and 10 in the weight room a lot, but I feel like it's very it's almost more, what's the, like a fast and elastic athlete can really embody those isometric or oscillatory reps. Those quick up and down, to them, that maximal probably feels more like a competition than maybe trying to get a wattage, like high output. I mean, I like both of them. I think athletes really can do well with both, but I feel like it's less, it's also, maybe I'll put it this way. It's less, I feel like it's less costly on your nervous system to do more rounds of the quick oscillatory maximal work than to do a bunch of max, put a bar speed monitor and do like wattage based outputs on the heavier bars. I think you can do a lot more of the Aussie stuff and a little bit less of the heavy traditional stuff.
I think a lot of the time it depends on your training phase, where you're at, and the type of effort you're doing, because you still need to move heavy loads quickly, especially if you have, like, say, a rugby player, you maybe American NFL player type thing who's in the, sorry, I don't know the terminology here properly, but, you know, these guys have to be able to move high loads quickly. So that stuff needs to be in your program, but perhaps you don't need to do that. You're just moving your body weight on the field. That's what your sport entails, not so much moving a heavy load. This is where these things can really can be really beneficial. And for me, like if I'm working with these populations, I want to try and get a little bit of everything. And it depends on the training phase, what we're going to do. So, I don't favor one over the other. I like both. And as I said before, Joel, I just want to reiterate that 85-90% of my stuff is just the big rocks, and then I play around with the rest.
Yeah. So this, even for the fighters where they aren't doing as much, like rugby would do more weightlifting, I'm sure, I would imagine, but like as a proportion, your fighters are doing more oscillatory than your rugby players? Probably, yes. Okay.
Probably. Yes, because I'll tell you why. Because with my rugby players, you've got a competition period. You've got a preseason. There's only one preseason per year. Whereas a fighter might have 3-4 fights a year. So they're going to have 3 or 4 peaking phases a year. So because they're doing that, you're recycling through the phases a lot quicker. Because in a rugby season or something like that, the competition period is such a long time that you can't play around with that stuff as much. Whereas with fighting, you might be peaking 3, 4, 5 times a year, depending on how many times they fight. So you're going to get that in a lot more, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. Well, hey, last question I have for you is I've seen you doing some different foot training exercises, lower leg type training. So I'll ask you, what are some core foot and lower leg type training movements outside of the extensive plyos that you utilize in your programming?
Well, I used to follow the Gate guys and Chris Corfus, and I used to do all those ankle shuffle drills and the tripod foot drills and things like that. I think been discussed in this podcast before. But I'm going to be honest with you, Joel. I thought I kind of knew what I was talking about. But when I've listened to guys like Gary Ward and David Gray, and I realised I don't really have much of a clue in regards to the foot, and it's something that I need to delve deeper. But one thing I've just finished Alex Effer's Evolve mentorship, and he actually talked a lot about the foot presentations, which I found really, really interesting. And he talked about foot presentations. You could either be in a heel strike foot, you could have a mid-stance foot, you could have a Taiwan foot. And a lot of that depended on kind of how your axial skeleton presented. And I think, Angus probably talked about all this in the Bill Hartman stuff. It's like wherever you have a wide infrasternal angle, narrow infrasternal angle, and all these types of things. So I think it's a lot of foot stuff will depend on how your hips move. So, they will talk about this triplanar. You should have triplanar ranges of motion. I think that's what they talk about. So I'm still getting my head around all this type of stuff, but I think it's important that you have internal, external rotation of your hips. And you probably need to have some supination and pronation of your foot. So rather before I was throwing a bomb of a lot of exercise and hoping something that was just going to stick, throwing a bunch of exercise at the wall. Now I'm trying to be a little bit more, I guess, of a sniper with these exercises, and I'll probably address the hip first. And David Gray's been a massive influence on some of the stuff that I do. So I've been doing a lot of his lower body basic movements with my athletes. So a lot of those scissor drills, those 9-9 knee roll drills where you have your foot in contact with the wall. So you kind of get that sensory motor feeling. And then I like to do all the hops on top of that. And then probably I'm doing a lot of soleus work, some calf work, some tib anterior work on top of that, and then a lot of unilateral exercises as my accessories. So the foot's still getting some type of training there. But it's something, mate, when you go into it, it's such a complex topic, and it's something that I kind of probably thought I knew, and it's something I need to go in a bit deeper so I have a better understanding. But yeah, they're the things I look at, mate, at the moment. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I was having almost a little bit of chuckle to myself in the sense of there was a moment a few years ago when I thought I really had the foot figured out, and then I started learning. It's like you're in your bubble, and then you get exposed to the next bubble out, which that next bubble out was the impact of the hips and everything coming down from the upstream onto the foot, which is funny because now I'm just like, man, like how did I not even be thinking about that? But it's like, wow, that's a huge element of it all. And I know David Gray, the first time he was on the podcast, was talking about like the hips impacting your ability to pronate, the ribs, even the jaw or whatever, which I haven't gotten that far yet. To the jaw, but it's really, I mean, it's, to me, nature is so complex, and I mean, yes, there's some simple things that I think can be really helpful, but at the end of the day too, that when we get integrated and there's different cases, there's a lot of things. Like I definitely I can definitely see it. So I like that like Alex Effer was talking about the different presentation styles and people more likely to strike on one versus the other. I think it's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, it's all very, very interesting stuff. And I, as you said, as I'm delving deeper to a lot of the things these guys are talking about, the influence of the pelvis and the thorax is just so important. And that's kind of where I've been researching and studying this year, going to a lot of these concepts, because honestly, when they first come out with these concepts, I think a lot of it's based off PRI principles and things like that. That's highly influenced. But when they were talking about it, I didn't really have an understanding of what they were talking about. So I've tried to delve a little bit deeper into these principles, and I've started sprinkling these things into my training, and even with my own training, Joel, because I'm banged up 38-year-old that tries to do Muay Thai and kickboxing most days of the week, and a lot of this like thorax, pelvis type things have really made me feel like I can go a little bit longer.
Yeah,
yeah, but it makes me feel like it makes you feel good a lot of the time. So it's just about finding that right balance. And I've been using a lot of these things more in my warm-up rather than just doing basic mobility things. Basic mobility, I'm starting to do a lot more breathing, taking the hips through different planes of motion, through the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, doing some drills with the foot where you might put more force through the heel, you might play around with it, you might put more force through the midfoot, and just seeing what types of muscles work and how it changes, just having a bit of understanding of where my kind of center of mass sits. It's something that I'm still experimenting with, but I think it's something that I want to continue to go down the rabbit hole. So I think it's really important, because the most important thing for my athletes is that they are playing the sport that they're doing. They're injury-free, and they can express themselves on the field. And if they have confidence in their body and they move well and have these movement options, and these movement options aren't always because of whether or not they know the actual movements, because they can't get in and out of his positions. So I think this is where that training, these principles can come into place, so you can really have a big influence on your athletes. That makes sense. I kind of went around about there, but
yeah. I will say, as we get older, it's definitely brings it more into the clear and present importance to work on these things ourselves, so our athletes can then benefit from utilizing them too. Because I would agree that it definitely it's definitely really impactful. So, but actually, that's the end of the questions I had for today, Graeme. It was great having you on. It was enjoyable for me, especially to get into a lot of like the way that you run the strength outside of just the big rocks and talking different game speed concepts. Yeah. So I appreciate you coming on the show today. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you.
That wraps up another show. Thank you so much for being here with us. If you enjoyed it, you can leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, whatever you're listening to. It would really help us out. We'll see you guys next week with another great guest.